Hold down. Show him your hand now.
My hands are up. This is my home. What's the reason for this?
We got a tip about someone who doesn't belong in this neighborhood. You fit that description.
I've lived here 6 years. I'm active duty.
You're making a mistake.
I don't care what you claim you are.
Turn around for this.
At 9:14 a.m. on a quiet Saturday morning in Virginia Beach, Senior Chief Darnell Okafor stood in his driveway, running a garden hose over the hood of his black F-150. He wore gym shorts, old sneakers, and a faded navy t-shirt with the sleeves cut off. The sun was already warm. The street was still. 2 houses down, a retired couple trimmed hedges along their walkway. Across the road, a teenager shot free throws against a garage-mounted hoop. American flags hung from porches on both sides of the block, including Darnell's. He was 38 years old, active-duty Navy SEAL, 16 years of decorated service, 3 combat deployments, and more classified operations than most people would believe if he told them. But out here, on Briarwood Lane, he was just the neighbor who kept his yard clean, waved at the mail carrier, and coached his son's flag football team every fall. He had lived in this house for 6 years, paid his mortgage on time every month, knew every family within 4 doors in either direction. Inside, his wife Simone, 36, a nurse practitioner at Centera General, was getting their kids ready for a trip to the aquarium. Elijah, 10, was arguing about which shoes to wear. Nadia, 7, was drawing at the kitchen table, tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. The plan was simple. Finish the truck, load the cooler, and be on the road by 10:30. A normal Saturday. A family that had earned every square foot of the life they had built. Darnell squeezed the nozzle and worked the water across the driver's side door, humming something low and tuneless, completely unaware that in less than 4 minutes, a black, unmarked SUV and a white government van would round the corner onto his street and change everything. They came fast. The black SUV pulled to the curb first, tires biting the asphalt hard enough to leave scuff marks. The white van followed close behind, parking at an angle that blocked half the driveway. 4 men stepped out in tactical vests, with ICE printed across the chest in bold yellow letters. No lights, no sirens, no advance notice to anyone on the block. The one in front was Supervisory Agent Craig Fenton, 44, a 17-year veteran of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He had a thick neck, a shaved head, and a walk that said he expected compliance before he opened his mouth. Inside the agency, Fenton was known for what leadership politely called high-volume enforcement, a term that masked a pattern his colleagues understood but rarely challenged. Fenton liked working mixed neighborhoods. He liked anonymous tips, and he had a quietly documented history of targeting black and brown residents in areas where their presence apparently made someone uncomfortable enough to pick up a phone. Behind him walked Agent Lyle Jessup, 31, 5 years on the job, eager, aggressive, and known among colleagues for one defining trait. He never questioned an order, not once. Not from Fenton, not from anyone above him. If Fenton moved, Jessup moved harder. 2 junior agents, Briggs and Salazar, stayed near the vehicles, arms crossed, scanning the street like they were entering a threat zone instead of a suburban cul-de-sac where someone's sprinkler was still running 2 lawns over. Darnell saw them before they reached him. His hand stayed on the hose. His posture didn't shift. 16 years of training meant he clocked everything in seconds. The vests, the weapons, the formation, the body language of men who had already made a decision. Fenton stopped 6 feet away, looked Darnell up and down, and spoke without introduction, without context, and without a warrant. "Put the hose down and put your hands where I can see them." Darnell dropped the hose. It hit the driveway with a wet slap and coiled near his feet, water still running in a thin stream toward the gutter. He raised both hands slowly, palms open, fingers spread. The movement was deliberate, controlled. The kind of compliance only someone trained to survive high-pressure situations could manage, without a single wasted motion. "What's this about?" he asked. His voice was steady, no edge, no panic. Just a man standing in his own driveway, asking a reasonable question. Fenton didn't match the tone. We have information that an undocumented individual is residing at this address. We're conducting an enforcement action. Darnell didn't blink. This is my home. I'm a United States citizen. Active duty Navy, 16 years. Fenton's expression didn't change. People claim that all the time. While Fenton spoke, Jessup moved. Not obviously, not fast, but with purpose. Stepping wide to Darnell's left and circling behind him the way someone positions themselves when they've already decided the next step involves hands on a body. Darnell felt it. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes on Fenton and his hands in the air. I need to see some ID, Fenton said. It's inside. Let me go get it. You're not going anywhere. Darnell paused, then asked the question Fenton had been avoiding since he stepped out of the SUV. Do you have a warrant? Fenton didn't answer. His jaw shifted slightly, and his eyes moved past Darnell toward the front door of the house. Turn around. Across the street, a screen door opened. Colonel Philip Dunham, 67, retired United States Marine Corps, white-haired and straight-backed, stepped onto his porch. He had lived on Briarwood Lane for 11 years. He knew Darnell. He knew Simone. He had watched Elijah grow up from a toddler riding a tricycle to a boy who called him Colonel Phil and waved every morning from the school bus window. Dunham stood still, arms at his sides, watching the scene unfold across the street with the sharp, quiet attention of a man who had spent 30 years reading tactical situations and recognized immediately that what he was seeing had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with something far uglier. The front door opened before Darnell could turn around. Simone stepped onto the porch in a white t-shirt and jeans, hair pulled back, car keys already in her hand from getting ready for the aquarium trip. She stopped the moment she saw it. Her husband, hands in the air, 4 federal agents spread across their lawn, one behind him, one facing him, 2 more flanking the vehicles like this was a raid on a cartel safe house and not a family home with a tricycle still leaning against the garage wall. What is going on? Her voice broke slightly on the last word, not from weakness, from the shock of walking into something no amount of professional training prepares you for, the sight of your husband being treated like a suspect in his own driveway. Jessup turned toward her immediately. Ma'am, go back inside. No. Simone didn't move. I'm a nurse practitioner. I live here. This is our home. I want to see your warrant. Fenton answered without looking at her. We don't need a warrant for an immigration enforcement action. You're on private property, Simone said. Her voice was stronger now, anger replacing the shock. You have no warrant, no probable cause, and my husband is a United States citizen. What exactly are you enforcing? Nobody answered. Simone reached into her back pocket and pulled out her phone. She held it up, camera facing Fenton, and pressed record. The red dot blinked on. Jessup stepped toward her, one hand extended. Put that phone away, now. Simone didn't flinch. Recording federal agents in a public-facing interaction is protected under the First Amendment. I'm not putting anything away. Jessup's hand stayed out, hovering between a command and a threat. Before he could say another word, a small figure appeared in the doorway behind Simone. Elijah. 10 years old, still wearing one shoe because he'd been in the middle of getting dressed when the noise outside pulled his mother to the door. His eyes were wide. His mouth was slightly open. He looked at his father standing in the driveway with his hands up, at the men in tactical vests, at his mother holding her phone like a shield, and he didn't say a word because he couldn't. The fear on his face was the kind that doesn't come with sound. From somewhere deeper inside the house, Nadia started crying. Not the cry of a child who dropped a toy or didn't get her way. The cry of a 7-year-old who could hear her mother's voice shaking and didn't understand why. This was not an enforcement action. This was a family being terrorized on their own property by men who hadn't bothered to verify a single piece of information before rolling up with weapons and demands. And every second of it was being recorded. Darnell kept his hands raised. His voice hadn't changed since the first word he spoke. Calm. Measured. The same tone he used when giving orders under fire, when seconds mattered and panic killed people. He looked directly at Fenton and said it one more time. "I'm asking you for a warrant or a supervisor. That's all I'm asking." Something shifted behind Fenton's eyes. Not reason, not reconsideration. Something closer to irritation that had been building since the moment Darnell didn't cower, didn't stammer, didn't give him the reaction he was used to getting. Fenton's hand shot forward and grabbed Darnell's left arm above the elbow. The grip was hard enough to leave bruises that would be photographed later as evidence. In one motion, he spun Darnell and slammed him chest first into the side of the F-150. The wet metal boomed under the impact. The truck rocked on its suspension. Before Darnell could exhale, Jessup was on him from behind. Both hands on Darnell's shoulders, driving him downward with the full weight of his body. Darnell's knees hit the concrete first, then his chest, then the side of his face. The sound was raw and sharp, skin dragging against hot pavement in the Virginia morning sun. It echoed off the garage door and carried across the street to where a dozen neighbors now stood frozen on porches and sidewalks. Darnell didn't resist, didn't tense, didn't swing. 16 years of training took over like a second nervous system. He went limp, turned his head to the side so he could breathe, and spoke in a voice loud enough to reach every phone that was already recording. "I am not resisting. I am not resisting." Fenton dropped a knee between Darnell's shoulder blades and pressed down. Jessup grabbed both wrists and wrenched them behind his back. The cuffs clicked tight, metal biting into skin that was already scraped raw from the driveway. A thin line of blood ran from Darnell's right cheek, where the concrete had torn the skin open. It pooled against the pavement beside a streak of soap and water still draining from the truck above him. Simone screamed. Not a word, just a sound, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than language. The sound of a woman watching her husband pinned to the ground by men who had no right to touch him. Elijah broke. The 10-year-old tore past his mother and ran down the porch steps toward his father. His one shoe slapped the walkway. His arms were pumping. His face was a mask of terror and fury that no child should ever have to wear. He made it 4 steps before Briggs stepped into his path. The junior agent didn't hesitate. He put both hands on the boy's chest and shoved him backward. Elijah stumbled, caught himself on the porch railing, and stood there shaking, staring at the man who had just put hands on him for the crime of running toward his own father. Nadia's crying was louder now, drifting through the open front door like a siren no one inside the house could turn off. Across the street, Colonel Dunham had his phone pressed to his ear. His free hand gripped the porch railing so hard his knuckles were white. He wasn't recording, he was calling. And the people on the other end of that line were about to make this the worst decision Craig Fenton ever made. They hauled Darnell to his feet by the chain between the cuffs. The metal dug deeper as his body weight shifted upward, and a second line of blood opened on his left wrist. He stood in his own driveway, shirtless, where the faded navy t-shirt had ridden up and torn at the collar during the takedown. Chest scraped, face bleeding, hands locked behind his back. The neighborhood watched. A man 3 houses down had stepped off his riding mower and stood in his yard with his mouth open. A woman walking her dog on the opposite sidewalk had stopped completely, phone raised, recording with both hands to keep it steady. A teenager on a bicycle had pulled over and was streaming live. Fenton patted Darnell's pockets. Gym shorts, no wallet, no phone, no weapons. Nothing. He found exactly what any reasonable person would expect to find on a man washing his truck on a Saturday morning, which was absolutely nothing. He didn't acknowledge the result, didn't slow down, didn't reconsider. He just stepped back and nodded at Jessup as if the absence of evidence was somehow irrelevant to what they were doing. Jessup turned toward the front door. Simone still stood on the porch, phone up, Elijah pressed behind her, one hand gripping the back of her shirt. Jessup climbed the first step. "Ma'am, we need to enter the residence." Simone's voice shook, but the words didn't. "Absolutely not." "We have authority under immigration enforcement to—" "No, you don't," she cut him off. "Not without a warrant, not without consent, not without a court order signed by a judge. My father is an attorney. I am a licensed healthcare professional. I know what you can and cannot do, and you cannot enter my home." Jessup stopped on the second step. His jaw tightened. His hand drifted toward his belt. Simone didn't move. She stood in the doorway of her own house with her children behind her and her husband bleeding in the driveway, and she did not move 1 inch. Fenton keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Fenton, requesting additional units to Briarwood Lane for enforcement support. Occupants are non-compliant." From the driveway, Darnell's voice cut through everything. Not shouting, not pleading, just clear, steady. Loud enough for every camera, every phone, every neighbor, and every body cam that should have been running on every agent's vest. "They have no warrant. They have no probable cause. I am a United States citizen and a Navy SEAL. This is my home. They did not verify anything before they put me on the ground. My wife has the right to refuse entry. My children are inside that house." He paused. Blood ran down his jaw and dripped onto the concrete next to the garden hose, still trickling water into the gutter. "And every single one of you is recording this." The street was silent after that. Not peaceful, not calm. The kind of silent that happens when an entire block of people realizes they are witnessing something that will not stay inside this neighborhood. Something that is about to become much, much bigger than the men in tactical vests ever imagined. Colonel Philip Dunham stepped off his porch and crossed Briarwood Lane with the kind of stride that hadn't changed since his last day in uniform. Straight back, squared shoulders, deliberate pace. He was 67 years old, white-haired, lean, and carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had commanded Marines in 2 theaters and retired with 30 years of service and a chest full of ribbons he never talked about unless someone asked. He had his phone in his right hand. The call had already been made. 2 calls, in fact. He stopped at the edge of Darnell's driveway, close enough for every camera on the street to pick up his voice, and looked directly at Fenton. "That man is Senior Chief Darnell Okafor. He lives here. He's active duty naval special warfare. I've known him for 6 years. His kids call me Colonel Phil." Fenton's eyes narrowed. "Sir, I need you to step back. This is a federal enforcement action." Dunham didn't step back, didn't raise his voice, didn't break eye contact. "I just got off the phone with the JAG office at Naval Station Norfolk and with Congressman Terrence Booker's district office. They are both making calls right now. The JAG duty officer asked me to confirm the agents' names and badge numbers, which I have. The Congressman's chief of staff asked me whether the service member was injured. I told her yes." The street felt like it stopped breathing. Fenton's jaw worked side to side, the first visible crack in the wall of authority he had built around himself since stepping out of the SUV. Behind him, Jessup shifted his weight and leaned in. "We should transport him to the field office, sort it out there." Dunham turned his gaze to Jessup with the kind of look that had once made lieutenants reconsider their life choices. "If you put that man in a vehicle, you will be making the worst decision of your careers." He paused. Let it land. "And I say that as someone who has watched careers end over far less than what's already on those cameras." Fenton looked at Dunham, looked at the phone still recording from porches and sidewalks, looked at Darnell standing in cuffs, blood drying on his cheek, silent and still as stone. For one long moment, something behind Fenton's eyes flickered. Not conscience. Calculation. He was weighing the options, measuring the risk, trying to decide whether pushing forward would strengthen his position or bury him. He chose wrong. "Briggs," he said without turning around, "bring the van closer." Briggs hesitated, looked at Salazar. Salazar shook his head, barely. A movement so small only someone standing next to him would have caught it. But Briggs followed the order. He always followed the order. He walked to the white government van, started the engine, and began pulling it forward to the edge of the driveway. Dunham exhaled through his nose, the slow, controlled breath of a man who had just watched someone step on a landmine and choose not to lift their foot. Then Fenton's phone rang. The sound cut through the driveway like a blade. Fenton glanced at the screen. His thumb hovered for half a second before he answered. He turned his body slightly, a reflex, as if angling away from the cameras would somehow make the conversation private. It wouldn't. Simone's phone was still recording from the porch. 3 neighbors had clear lines of sight. and Darnell, standing 6 feet away in handcuffs, could hear every word. The voice on the other end belonged to Regional Field Office Director Christine Nakamura. She was 52, a 24-year veteran of federal law enforcement, and she had received 3 phone calls in the span of 9 minutes. The first from Naval Special Warfare Command, the second from the Base JAG at Naval Station Norfolk, the third from the district office of a sitting United States congressman. Each call said the same thing. One of your agents has an active-duty Navy SEAL in handcuffs on his own property without a warrant. Nakamura did not waste words. Do you have a warrant? Fenton's voice dropped. No, ma'am, but we received a tip that... Do you have a target name that matches the resident at that address? Silence. Fenton opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The tip referenced the address we were acting on. Is the individual you have in custody a United States citizen? A pause that lasted long enough for Darnell to hear his own heartbeat. Yes. The silence from the other end of the line was worse than any shouting could have been. It lasted 4 full seconds. When Nakamura spoke again, her voice hadn't risen a single decibel, but every word landed like a hammer driving a nail into a coffin. Uncuff him. Do not enter the home. Do not transport. Hold your position. I am sending oversight from this office immediately. A beat. Then, and Fenton, your body cameras better be running. Every single one of them. The call ended. Fenton lowered the phone. His face had changed. The color was gone. The authority was gone. The posture that had carried him up this driveway like he owned the street had collapsed inward, replaced by the rigid stillness of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was already gone. Jessup looked at him, waiting for direction. For the first time since he joined Fenton's unit, there was no direction to follow. Briggs sat in the van with the engine running, one hand on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at a scene that had just shifted in a way he could feel in his chest. Salazar stood near the rear bumper, arms at his sides, watching Fenton's face with the expression of someone who had known this moment was coming long before today. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The garden hose still ran in a thin stream across the driveway, pooling near Darnell's bare feet, mixing with the blood that had dripped from his jaw onto the concrete of his own home. The power on Briarwood Lane had just changed hands, and it was never going back. Fenton reached for the cuffs without making eye contact. His hands moved mechanically, key turning in the lock, metal releasing from skin that was swollen and raw and streaked with dried blood. The left cuff came off first, then the right. Darnell's arms dropped to his sides. He didn't rub his wrists, didn't shake out the pain, didn't look at Fenton, didn't say a single word to the man who had put him on the ground in front of his children for no reason that would survive a single page of legal scrutiny. He turned and walked toward the porch. His steps were steady but slower than before. The scrapes on his chest and knees pulled with every movement. The cut on his cheek had stopped bleeding, but the blood had dried in a dark line that ran from his cheekbone to his jaw. His torn t-shirt hung loose at the collar. He looked like a man walking out of something no one should have to walk out of in their own front yard on a Saturday morning. Simone met him at the top of the steps. She didn't speak either. She put one hand on his face, the uninjured side, and the other on his chest, and she held him there for a moment while her whole body trembled with something that wasn't fear anymore. It was rage, the kind that doesn't make noise because it runs too deep. Elijah was sitting on the porch floor with his back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest, sobbing in sharp, broken bursts that shook his entire frame. His one shoe was still on. The other foot was bare and dirty from the walkway. He didn't look up when his father reached him. Darnell crouched down slowly, wincing, and put a hand on his son's head. Elijah grabbed his father's arm with both hands and held on like he was afraid someone would take him away again. Inside, Nadia would not come to the door. She had moved from the kitchen table to the hallway closet, where Simone would later find her sitting in the dark with her hands over her ears and her drawings crumpled beside her. The neighborhood was silent. Not the comfortable silence of a Saturday morning, the heavy, airless silence of a street full of people who had just watched something they would never forget. Phones were still raised, screens still glowing. Nobody had stopped recording because nobody believed it was truly over. Colonel Dunham stood in the middle of the Okafor's front yard, arms crossed over his chest, positioned between the porch and the driveway like a sentry who had no intention of leaving his post. His phone was in his shirt pocket now. The calls had been made. What came next was no longer in his hands. 3 houses east, a woman named Gloria Bynum stood on her porch with her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking quickly, her voice low but urgent. She had called the tip line for Wavy News 10 and was giving them the address, a description of what she'd seen, and the 6-second video she had already texted to her sister, her pastor, and 2 group chats. Across the street, a 23-year-old neighbor named Devin Kessler had posted the first video to social media before the cuffs were even off. 45 seconds of footage showing Darnell face down on concrete, Fenton's knee on his back, and the audio of a 10-year-old boy being stopped by a federal agent on his own front walkway. The video had 200 views by the time Fenton uncuffed Darnell. It would have 200,000 before sundown. Fenton and his team retreated to their vehicles in silence. Jessup climbed into the passenger seat of the SUV and closed the door without looking back. Briggs turned off the van's engine and sat with both hands on the wheel, staring forward at nothing. Salazar leaned against the rear quarter panel with his arms folded, his face unreadable, but his posture that of a man who understood exactly what he had just been part of. Fenton stood beside the driver's door for a moment, scanning the street, the phones, the faces. Then he got in and pulled the door shut. None of them left. Nakamura had said, "Hold your position," so they held it. 4 federal agents sitting in government vehicles on a quiet suburban street, waiting for oversight to arrive, while a family they had just brutalized sat together on their own porch, trying to understand what had happened to their Saturday morning. The damage was done. The concrete had scraped the skin, the cuffs had cut the wrists, the boy had been shoved, the girl had hidden in a closet. The video was already moving through the internet at a speed none of them could comprehend, and the consequences hadn't even started. They started within hours. By noon, a duty officer at Naval Criminal Investigative Service had received a formal notification from Naval Special Warfare Command. An active duty senior chief had been physically detained, injured, and handcuffed without a warrant by federal immigration agents on his own residential property in the presence of his wife and minor children. NCIS opened a case file before lunch. Naval Special Warfare Command assigned a legal liaison from the Judge Advocate General's office at Norfolk to coordinate directly with the Okafor family. The liaison, a lieutenant commander who had handled service member rights cases for 7 years, reviewed the first neighbor video within minutes of arriving at her desk. She watched it twice, picked up the phone, and called the Pentagon's Office of General Counsel. At the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of Inspector General received a referral from Regional Field Office Director Christine Nakamura before she even arrived at Briarwood Lane. The referral flagged the incident as a potential Fourth Amendment violation involving unlawful detention, use of force without legal basis, and failure to verify target identity prior to enforcement action. DHS Civil Rights and Civil Liberties opened a parallel review. 2 investigations into the same incident, running on separate tracks inside the same department. That afternoon, Congressman Terrence Booker's office released a public statement. The congressman called the incident deeply disturbing and demanded a full and transparent accounting from ICE leadership, including the evidentiary basis for the enforcement action, the identity of the anonymous tipster, and the disciplinary status of every agent involved. The statement was picked up by wire services within the hour. By evening, the videos were everywhere. Devin Kessler's original 45-second clip had been shared, reposted, and screen recorded across every major platform. Gloria Bynum's footage, shot from a higher angle 3 houses away, showed the full scope of the scene: the SUV, the van, the agents, the takedown, the boy running toward his father and being pushed back. Simone's own recording from the porch captured audio the other cameras missed, Jessup telling her to put the phone away, Fenton claiming they didn't need a warrant, and Darnell's voice from the driveway, steady and clear, declaring his name, his rank, his citizenship, and his right to stand on his own property. By Monday morning, every major news outlet in the country had the story. The images were inescapable. A black man in a torn t-shirt, face bleeding, handcuffed in front of an American flag hanging from his own porch. A child being blocked by a federal agent. A woman standing in her doorway holding a phone like a shield. The headlines wrote themselves. And then the internal records surfaced. The anonymous tip that had sent Fenton to that address was a single phone call, placed from a prepaid number with no corroborating evidence, no supporting documentation, and no follow-up verification. The caller had named an individual. That individual did not match Darnell Okafor, did not match Simone Okafor, did not match anyone who had ever resided at that address. A basic search of public records, the kind that takes less than 3 minutes on any law enforcement database, would have confirmed that the homeowner was an active-duty United States Navy senior chief with a valid security clearance and 16 years of military service. Fenton never ran that search, never checked the name against the address, never consulted a supervisor before assembling a 4-agent tactical team and driving to a suburban cul-de-sac to confront a man who was washing his truck. The question that federal investigators, congressional staffers, and military attorneys were all now asking was the same one Darnell had asked on his own driveway before anyone bothered to listen. Do you have a warrant? The answer had always been no, and everything that followed had been built on nothing. The body camera footage arrived at the DHS Office of Inspector General on a secured drive 3 days after the incident. There were 4 files, one from each agent's chest-mounted camera. Fenton's was the longest. Jessup's captured the closest angles. Briggs's showed the porch. Salazar's, pointed mostly at the street and the vehicles, would turn out to be the least relevant to the physical confrontation, but the most revealing in one critical respect. It showed that from his position near the van, every element of what was happening on that driveway was fully visible, fully audible, and fully avoidable. The OIG review team watched Fenton's footage first. It began with the SUV pulling on to Briarwood Lane. The camera caught the neighborhood exactly as it was. Quiet. Suburban. Flags on porches. A man in gym shorts running a hose over a pickup truck in his own driveway. No threat indicators. No suspicious activity. No exigent circumstances. Just a Saturday morning that looked like every other Saturday morning on that block for the past 6 years. The audio confirmed what the neighbor videos had already shown, but added layers the civilian phones hadn't captured. When Darnell told Fenton he was active duty Navy, the body camera picked up Fenton's response in full. The dismissive exhale. The half-turn of his head. The flat, unbothered tone of a man who had already decided who he was dealing with before he heard a single word. And beneath Fenton's voice, just barely caught by the microphone's ambient pickup, Jessup's muttered comment from behind Darnell's left shoulder. They all say that. 3 words. Quiet enough that Darnell may not have heard them in the moment, but the body camera heard them. And the timestamp placed them 4 seconds before Fenton demanded ID from a man who had already identified himself as a United States citizen and a senior chief in the United States Navy. Briggs's camera told its own story. It captured the moment Elijah broke past his mother and ran down the steps toward his father. The footage showed the boy's face, wide-eyed, terrified, his mouth open in a cry the microphone picked up as a high, wordless sound that one reviewer would later describe in her notes as the worst thing on any of the 4 recordings. Then it showed Briggs stepping into the boy's path, both hands making contact with Elijah's chest, and the backward stumble that followed. The boy's shoulder hit the porch railing. His bare foot slipped on the bottom step. He caught himself. He didn't fall. But the footage made clear that a federal agent in a tactical vest had put hands on a 10-year-old child who was running toward his own father on his own property during an action that had no legal basis from the first second to the last. Fenton's camera captured him threatening Simone about her phone. The audio was crisp. "Put that phone away. Now." Followed by Simone's response, steady despite the visible tremor in her hands. Recording federal agents in a public-facing interaction is protected under the First Amendment. The camera also caught the moment Fenton keyed his radio to request backup and described the family as non-compliant, a word that would be flagged by every reviewer who watched the footage because at no point had any member of the Okafor family refused a lawful order. There had been no lawful orders to refuse. And then there was the phone call. Fenton's body camera captured it from his chest, the angle tilted slightly as he turned away from the crowd, as if turning his body could keep the conversation private. It couldn't. The microphone picked up his side clearly, the clipped "yes, ma'am," the stumbling explanation about the tip, the pause after Nakamura asked whether the man in custody was a citizen, and then the silence after she told him to uncuff, hold position, and make sure the cameras were running. The footage captured what happened to Fenton's face in the seconds after that call ended. The color draining from his cheeks. The way his eyes moved across the street, scanning the phones, the neighbors, the porch where Simone still stood recording. The look of a man who had just realized that the ground he was standing on had been gone since the moment he stepped out of the SUV. The OIG's internal review memorandum was completed within the week. It was 9 pages long, and written in the kind of language that federal investigators use when the facts are so clear that restraint becomes its own form of emphasis. The memo noted that at no point during the encounter did any agent present or reference a judicial warrant. At no point did any agent identify a valid enforcement target by name. At no point did any agent articulate probable cause for the detention, search, or use of force. The tip that initiated the operation was anonymous, unverified, and did not match any individual associated with the address. The final line of the memo would be quoted in congressional hearings, news reports, and legal briefs for months to come. It read, "This incident represents one of the most clearly documented Fourth Amendment violations in recent agency history." The suspensions came fast. By the end of the week following the OIG memo's completion, Supervisory Agent Craig Fenton and Agent Lyle Jessup were placed on immediate, unpaid administrative suspension. Their credentials were collected, their access to agency systems was revoked, their government-issued firearms were turned into the regional armory and logged under evidence hold. Neither man was permitted to enter any ICE facility without escort. Agent Briggs was suspended with pay pending a separate review of his physical contact with Elijah Okafor. The distinction between paid and unpaid suspension was procedural, not moral. The agency needed time to determine whether Briggs's actions constituted independent misconduct or whether he had been acting within the scope of Fenton's unlawful direction. Either way, the footage of a federal agent pushing a 10-year-old boy on his own porch had already become the single most shared image from the incident. No amount of procedural language was going to soften what those frames showed. Agent Salazar was placed on administrative duty and reassigned to a desk at the regional office. He was the only member of the team who had not made physical contact with any member of the Okafor family. He had remained near the vehicles throughout the encounter, and when investigators sat him down for his first interview, he cooperated fully. He told them what he had seen, what he had heard, what he had felt standing by that van watching a senior agent with 17 years of service slam an unarmed man into a truck in his own driveway because he didn't like the answers he was getting. Salazar's testimony would become one of the most damaging elements of the internal case, not because he had done something wrong, but because he confirmed that everyone present knew from the very beginning that something was. Internal Affairs pulled Fenton's personnel file. What they found was not surprising to anyone who had worked with him, but it was devastating on paper. 11 formal complaints over 9 years. 7 of them filed by minority homeowners, Black and Latino residents in mixed neighborhoods who described the same pattern with almost identical language. An unannounced visit. Vague claims about a tip or a report. Demands for identification. Aggressive posture. Threats of arrest. refusal to show a warrant or name a target. In each case, the complaint had been reviewed internally and closed without discipline. In 4 of those cases, the reviewer's notes contained some version of the same phrase. Agent acted within discretionary authority based on available information. The information, in every case, was an unverified, anonymous tip. Jessup's file was thinner, but told its own story. 2 prior complaints of excessive force, both filed by individuals Jessup had detained during ride-along operations with Fenton's unit. Both dismissed. One of the complainants, a 54-year-old legal permanent resident from El Salvador, had described Jessup grabbing him by the back of the neck during a knock-and-talk at his apartment. The complaint was closed after Jessup claimed the man had made a sudden movement. No video existed. No witnesses were interviewed beyond the agents present. The pattern was now undeniable. Fenton's unit had conducted dozens of knock-and-talk operations in mixed-race neighborhoods across the region over a 4-year period. The operations were initiated by anonymous tips, many of which were never corroborated, never cross-referenced with existing databases, and never reviewed by a supervisor before agents were deployed. A disproportionate number of those operations targeted Black residents who turned out to be United States citizens with no connection to any immigration enforcement matter. The tips were the pretext, the badge was the weapon, and the lack of oversight was the permission. Senior agency leadership was briefed in a closed session at DHS headquarters. The briefing included the OIG memo, the body camera footage, Salazar's statement, the complaint history, and the operational data from Fenton's unit. The room was quiet when the footage played. It stayed quiet for a long time after it ended. That afternoon, the Secretary of Homeland Security was personally informed. The briefing was short. The facts didn't require elaboration. A decorated active-duty Navy SEAL had been slammed to the ground, handcuffed, and held without a warrant on his own property, while his wife was threatened and his 10-year-old son was physically pushed by a federal agent. The entire incident was captured on body camera and civilian video. The tip was baseless. The target didn't exist. And the agent who led the operation had 11 prior complaints that the agency had never acted on. The secretary asked one question. How many others? The answer was still being counted. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened its federal investigation on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after the incident on Briarwood Lane. The scope was broader than a single driveway in Virginia Beach. Investigators were authorized to examine not only the Okafor incident, but the full operational history of Fenton's unit, including every knock-and-talk conducted over the previous 4 years, every anonymous tip acted upon without verification, and every complaint filed against agents under Fenton's supervision that had been reviewed and dismissed without discipline. The investigation would eventually involve more than a dozen federal attorneys, a forensic data team, and interviews with 39 individuals who had been subjected to unannounced enforcement actions by the same unit in the same region, using the same pattern of unverified tips and warrantless confrontation. NCIS formally referred its own case file to the Pentagon's Office of General Counsel the same week. The referral included Darnell's sworn statement, the body camera footage, the neighbor videos, Simone's recording, medical documentation of Darnell's injuries, and the child psychologist's preliminary assessment of Elijah and Nadia. The Pentagon's legal office reviewed the referral and within 48 hours issued an internal recommendation that the Department of Defense formally intervene as an interested party in any federal civil rights proceeding arising from the incident. The recommendation noted that the unlawful detention and physical assault of an active-duty Special Operations Service member on his own property constituted not only a violation of his constitutional rights, but an affront to the military institution he served. Darnell retained a civil rights attorney named Nadine St. Clair. She was 49, a former federal prosecutor who had spent the last 14 years in private practice, representing victims of law enforcement misconduct. She had argued before the Fourth Circuit 3 times and won twice. She had secured 8-figure settlements against municipal police departments and federal agencies. She did not take cases she couldn't prove, and when she reviewed the body camera footage, the civilian recordings, the OIG memo, Fenton's complaint history, and the agency's own internal communications, She told Darnell and Simone the same thing she had told every client she had ever taken on. "We're not asking for anything. We're documenting what they did and letting the evidence demand what's owed." The federal lawsuit was filed in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. The defendants were named individually and institutionally: Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security, Supervisory Agent Craig Fenton, Agent Lyle Jessup, Agent Briggs. The complaint cited violations of the Fourth Amendment, excessive force, assault and battery, false arrest, civil rights violations under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, and intentional infliction of emotional distress on minor children. The section on Elijah and Nadia was 11 pages long. It detailed the weeks following the incident in clinical, devastating terms, drawn directly from the report of Dr. Yvonne Favreau, a child psychologist retained by the family. Elijah had not slept through the night since the morning of the incident. He had recurring nightmares in which men in dark vests came into the house and took his father away. He refused to play in the front yard. He refused to answer the front door. When a FedEx driver in a dark uniform approached the porch to deliver a package, Elijah locked himself in the bathroom and would not come out for 40 minutes. His grades had dropped. His teacher reported he was withdrawn and easily startled by loud noises. Nadia's symptoms were different, but no less severe. She had developed a fear of any uniformed authority figure, including school security officers and even a firefighter who visited her school for a safety presentation. She had resumed bedwetting after 2 years without an accident. She drew pictures of her house with dark figures standing outside. When Dr. Favreau asked her to describe what happened that morning, Nadia said 5 words that appeared in the complaint in bold type: "The bad men hurt Daddy." The psychologist's report concluded that both children exhibited symptoms consistent with acute stress disorder, with a significant risk of progression to post-traumatic stress disorder if left untreated. The report recommended ongoing therapy for both children and noted that the trauma was compounded by the fact that it occurred at their home, the one place children are supposed to feel unconditionally safe. The Pentagon's public statement was released the same day the lawsuit was filed. It was brief, 4 paragraphs, issued jointly by the Department of Defense Press Office and Naval Special Warfare Command. It confirmed that an active duty senior chief assigned to Naval Special Warfare had been subjected to unlawful detention and physical force by federal immigration agents at his personal residence, without a warrant, without probable cause, and without any valid enforcement basis. It stated that the Department of Defense considered the treatment of its service members a matter of institutional concern, and that the Pentagon was cooperating fully with all ongoing federal investigations. The final paragraph was the one that made headlines. It read in part that the men and women who serve in special operations do so at extraordinary personal risk and sacrifice, and that the Department of Defense would not stand silently when one of its own was assaulted on American soil by agents of his own government. It was the kind of statement the Pentagon almost never makes, and the fact that they made it told everyone paying attention exactly how seriously the institution was taking what had happened on Briarwood Lane. Craig Fenton was terminated on a Thursday. The letter was hand-delivered to his home by a DHS administrative officer, accompanied by 2 agents from the Office of Professional Responsibility. It listed 5 grounds for dismissal: gross misconduct in the execution of duties, violation of Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure, failure to obtain a judicial warrant prior to initiating a residential enforcement action, falsifying the evidentiary basis for an enforcement operation, and conduct unbecoming a federal law enforcement officer. Each charge was supported by direct reference to body camera footage, internal communications, and sworn witness testimony. His federal law enforcement credentials were permanently revoked. His name was entered into the National Decertification Index, a database that tracks officers stripped of their authority to serve in any law enforcement capacity. He would never carry a badge again. Not for ICE, not for any federal agency, not for any state or local department willing to check the registry before making a hire. Jessup's termination came the same day. His letter cited excessive force against a compliant individual, participation in an unlawful arrest without probable cause or judicial authorization, and failure to intervene when a supervising agent exceeded lawful authority. The last charge was notable because it acknowledged what Jessup's entire career had been built on ignoring: that following an illegal order does not absolve the person who follows it. His credentials were revoked. His file was flagged. Briggs was fired the following week after a separate review board concluded that his physical contact with Elijah Okafor constituted unreasonable force against a minor during an operation that lacked any lawful basis. The board's report noted that regardless of whether Briggs believed he was preventing the child from entering a dangerous situation, no dangerous situation existed. There was no arrest in progress. There was no weapon. There was no threat. There was a 10-year-old boy running toward his father and a federal agent who put both hands on the child's chest and pushed him backward. The distinction between restraint and assault, the board wrote, depends entirely on context, and in this context, there was no legal authority for any agent to be on that property at all. Federal prosecutors moved on the criminal charges within the month. A grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia returned indictments against Fenton and Jessup. Fenton was charged with 2 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law pursuant to 18 U.S.C. Section 242, 1 for the unlawful detention and assault of Darnell Okafor, and 1 for the unlawful threat and intimidation of Simone Okafor. He was additionally charged with conspiracy to deprive civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Section 241, based on evidence that the pattern of unverified, tip-based enforcement actions within his unit constituted a coordinated practice of targeting residents without legal basis. Jessup was charged with 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law for his role in the physical takedown and cuffing of a compliant United States citizen. The civil lawsuit never reached trial. 4 months after it was filed, attorneys for DHS requested a settlement conference. Nadine St. Clair walked into that conference with 14 binders of evidence, including body camera footage, civilian video, the OIG memo, Fenton's complaint history, internal agency emails, the child psychologist's report, Darnell's medical records, and the sworn statements of 9 neighbors, 3 of whom were themselves veterans. The government's attorneys reviewed the materials, consulted with senior DHS counsel, and returned with an offer within the week. The settlement was in the millions. The exact figure was sealed at the government's request, but legal observers familiar with the terms placed it well above what comparable cases had yielded in the same circuit. More significant than the money were the structural reforms written into the agreement. DHS agreed to implement mandatory judicial warrant requirements for all residential immigration enforcement actions. Anonymous tips would be subject to independent verification by a supervising agent and cross-referenced against public records and federal databases before any tactical deployment. A civilian oversight board would be established with authority to review complaint patterns against individual agents and flag cases for investigation when thresholds were met. All agents within the region would undergo mandatory retraining on Fourth Amendment protections, de-escalation procedures, and the legal rights of citizens during enforcement encounters. And there was one final provision that Nadine St. Clair had insisted on, and that DHS had agreed to only after extended negotiation. A formal written apology from the Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement to the Okafor family. Not a press statement, not a departmental acknowledgement. A letter, signed, addressed to Darnell, Simone, Elijah, and Nadia by name, stating that what happened on their property was wrong, that it should never have occurred, and that the agency accepted responsibility for the actions of its agents. The letter arrived at the house on Briarwood Lane on a Monday afternoon. Simone opened it at the kitchen table. She read it once to herself, then she folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the counter next to a permission slip for Elijah's field trip and a crayon drawing Nadia had made of their house with the sun above it and 4 stick figures standing in the yard. She didn't frame it. She didn't celebrate it. It was accountability on paper. It mattered, but it didn't undo what her children had seen. Darnell returned to duty on a Monday morning, 19 days after the incident. He drove to base in the same black F-150, wearing a pressed uniform, credentials around his neck, coffee in the cup holder. His commanding officer met him privately before he reported to his unit. The conversation was brief. "You handled it the right way, Senior Chief. Your family handled it the right way. We've got your back, and that's not just talk." Darnell nodded, thanked him, walked to his team room and went back to work like the professional he had been for 16 years. He didn't speak publicly, not to the reporters who called the house and left messages Simone deleted without listening to, not to the producers who sent emails requesting interviews with subject lines that used words like exclusive and powerful and your story needs to be heard. Not to the podcasters, the cable news bookers, the documentary teams, or the advocacy organizations that wanted him to stand behind a microphone and turn what happened on his driveway into a moment. He said no to all of them. Quietly, firmly, the same way he said everything. 5 weeks after the incident, he released a single written statement through Nadine St. Clair's office. It was 4 sentences long. "I've served this country in places most people will never know about. I never expected to be treated like a criminal on my own property by my own government. My children watched their father put face down on concrete by men who didn't care enough to check whether they had the right house or the right person. I don't want fame. I want it documented so it doesn't happen to the next family." He never gave another public statement. He never appeared on camera. He never wrote an op-ed or launched a social media account or allowed his name to become a brand. The statement stood on its own because the evidence had always stood on its own. He didn't need to perform his pain for anyone. The body cameras and the neighbor phones had already done that. Simone took longer to find her footing. Not because she was weaker, but because her injuries were different. Darnell's scrapes healed. His wrist stopped aching. The cut on his cheek became a faint line that faded over months. But Simone carried the weight of what she had seen from the doorway. Her husband on the ground, her son being pushed, her daughter hiding in a closet, and the particular helplessness of standing on her own porch, holding a phone, because it was the only weapon she had. She went back to work at Centera General 2 weeks after the incident. She cared for patients, ran triage shifts, documented vitals, and held herself together with the same discipline she had always brought to everything. But at night, after the kids were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a laptop and began building something. 3 months after the settlement was finalized, Simone formally established the Okafor Family Legal Defense Fund. It was a nonprofit designed to provide emergency legal representation to families targeted by unlawful immigration enforcement actions, specifically those who lacked the resources, the connections, or the proximity to someone like Colonel Dunham to stop what was happening before it went too far. The fund partnered with civil rights attorneys across 4 states. It created a hotline. It distributed Know Your Rights materials in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole through churches, community health centers, and public schools. In its first year of operation, the fund provided direct legal assistance to 31 families. Simone never sought attention for it. The fund's website listed her only as a co-founder. But the families who called the hotline at 2 a.m, when agents knocked on their doors without warrants, knew exactly who had made it possible. And that was enough. Colonel Philip Dunham was honored by the local NAACP chapter at a quiet ceremony held at a community center in Virginia Beach 4 months after the incident. The citation praised his immediate and decisive intervention on behalf of his neighbor, his willingness to use his military contacts to ensure accountability, and his physical presence on the Okafor property at a moment when his standing between a family and an unlawful action may have prevented the situation from escalating further. Dunham accepted the recognition with visible discomfort. He wore a blazer and no tie. He shook hands. He thanked the chapter president, and when he was asked to say a few words, he kept it short. "I didn't do anything special. I walked across the street because what I saw was wrong. Any neighbor should have done the same. The fact that it mattered says more about the problem than it does about me." He went home afterward, sat on his porch, and watched the sun go down over Briarwood Lane the same way he had 1,000 times before. The Okafor family stayed in their home. There were conversations about moving, late-night talks at the kitchen table after the kids were asleep, where Simone and Darnell weighed the cost of staying in a place where the worst morning of their lives had played out in full view of every neighbor they had. But they stayed, because leaving would have meant that what Fenton did had taken more than skin and sleep and safety. It would have taken their home, and they were not willing to give him that. Elijah's recovery was slow and uneven. For the first 2 months, he would not go past the front door without an adult beside him. He stopped riding his bike in the cul-de-sac. He flinched at car doors slamming. His therapist worked with him weekly, building back the sense of security that had been torn from him in a matter of minutes on a Saturday morning when he was still putting on his shoes. The breakthrough came on a Sunday afternoon in early fall. Darnell was in the driveway replacing a headlight on the truck. Elijah stood at the front door for a long time, watching through the screen. Then he pushed it open, walked down the steps, and sat on the driveway next to the toolbox. He didn't say anything. Darnell didn't either. He just handed his son a flashlight, and they worked together in silence until the sun dropped behind the roofline and Simone called them in for dinner. Nadia took longer. She still slept with the hallway light on. She still drew pictures of the house with dark figures outside. But Dr. Favreau noted in her 6-month report that the figures were getting smaller. And in one drawing, made the week before Thanksgiving, the dark figures were gone entirely, replaced by 4 stick figures in the yard, 2 tall and 2 small, standing next to a black truck with a yellow sun above them. Months later, on a Saturday morning in early spring, Darnell Okafor stood in his driveway on Briarwood Lane, running a garden hose over the hood of his F-150. He wore gym shorts, old sneakers, and a faded navy t-shirt with the sleeves cut off. The sun was warm. The street was still. American flags hung from porches on both sides of the block, including his. Elijah sat on the tailgate with a sponge in his hand, scrubbing at a mud streak near the wheel well, complaining that the water was too cold. Nadia stood a few feet away, holding the nozzle attachment Darnell had unscrewed for her, aiming a weak spray at the front tire and laughing every time the water splashed back onto her shoes. Simone watched from the porch with a cup of coffee and her phone in her pocket. Not recording. Not needing to. Just watching her family, in their driveway, on their street, in front of their home. The scene looked the same as it had that morning. A man washing his truck, kids beside him, a neighborhood at peace. But the audience knows now what it costs to protect it. What it costs to remain standing in a place where you belong when men with badges and weapons tell you that you don't. What it cost 2 children to learn at 7 and 10 years old that the uniform their father wore every day for 16 years was not enough to protect him from the uniform that showed up uninvited on a Saturday morning. And what it cost a family to stay, to plant their feet on concrete that once held blood, and to refuse, quietly and completely, to be moved. If you think this situation was bad, wait until you see what happens in the case on the right-hand side.